I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. How is this global collapse affecting our mental and physical health? Let's hear firsthand from South African journalist Leonie Joubert as she shares about her experience of the collapse in South Africa. Am I right that you, in pronouncing your name, Leonie Joubert?
Yes, that's correct. It is originally of French origin, but it's in South Africa we pronounce it Joubert.
Joubert. Got it.
Joubert.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to say it the way you want it said, so that's great. That's why I'm asking. And I'm also curious if I could just ask you, what has gotten you to the place where you career-wise or practice-wise, gotten you to the place where your words come across in such a profound and clear way in what is easily the most important topic humanity's ever had to face. So I just curious, are you a writer by trade or?
Yes. So I started out as I studied journalism and history when I was a student, and just quite by accident fell into the realm of writing about climate change, and that was about 17 years ago. So I've been using sort of different forms of storytelling to try and grapple with this very complex issue, mostly looking at the impacts of rising temperatures and carbon pollution for Southern Africa. And I've written a number of books around that. I've also written around sort of food systems, why urban food systems make us hungry, heavy, and sick. So that's kind of been my focus, of trying to use storytelling to weave together scientific research. And how I got to be here, one just brain trains oneself into storytelling. The more you do it, the better you get at it. I think this year has been interesting because a very significant daily newspaper here in South Africa called the Daily Maverick, it's an online newspaper. Right. They have suddenly woken up to the climate crisis in the way that few other local media houses have. And they have pulled together a small team of writers who are content specialists in the area. And they have given us an unprecedented platform. And in many respects, they're allowing us to write whatever we want in whatever way we want. And that's very unusual for me as a writer. I'm usually writing to a strict editorial brief.
Sure.
And I think, the reason you and I are talking is because I've written a couple of pieces on the emotional fallout that comes from being at the coalface of writing about this. And it's unusual for me to write something so very personal. But it felt, and we can talk about that in a minute, but it felt really important to do so. Because what I have experienced as someone writing in this field for so long and feeling impotent, feeling that the message is not getting out there, I think there are many, many people who are feeling the same. So I decided to write about my own, dare I say it, mental breakdown this year, as a way of allowing other people to recognize it in themselves and giving them permission to talk about it. And since doing so, I've just encountered so many people, professionals who are working in sustainability, as well as people who are just passionate activists and politically awake, who are going through exactly the same thing, but have felt too embarrassed to talk about it because, mental health is often still quite a stigmatized thing. So yes, I wrote two important pieces for the Daily Maverick this year. The one was at the beginning of the year, where I just, in a moment of absolute exasperation, I penned this long piece about how frustrating it is to have been writing about this for so long and feeling like no one's listening. And then, of course, the second piece, which I think is why you and I are speaking, was how several months later I actually ended up having what I would describe as a medical emergency as a result of the mental health breakdown that came from the despair of realizing how serious this thing really is.
Yeah. Well, let me stop you there. We're already so in momentum in this conversation, and I should tell you just a little bit about myself and this body of work, so that we can continue in this momentum, continue on this track, and go basically as far as you'd like to go. I was very moved by your piece, this most recent one, and I'm looking forward to hopefully getting the link from you of the first one you mentioned. And you know, I've really just started us in an awkward way, and I so appreciate you've covered so much ground in a short period of time. And the awkwardness that I started us out with is I would love to have given an official opening of the podcast, as I usually do. You know, I'm Dean Walker, and this is the Poetry of Predicament podcast, and I'm very excited to have this particular guest today. And I now can sincerely say that, you know, we've just met just before hitting the record button, and in just these short couple of minutes that you were answering the first question of what got you to this level of articulation and depth of sharing, that you're able to put together this article that is indeed the only one I've read from you yet. And that's what you've been responding to. So thank you. And I don't mind at all that we do things a little out of order. It's just so fine. And I literally don't know where to start. You planted a few seeds there of potential direction, and you know, somehow the one that I would most like to touch in with a little bit is your own experience of our collective reluctance to admit where we are and perhaps who we are in these times, and how that shows up when someone of a particular level of sensitivity has symptoms that are just not comfortable to be around. Symptoms that are probably something of a canary in a coal mine, kind of an indicator that something is desperately wrong. When all the coal miners around us, if you will, just don't want to hear about it. It isn't just an uncomfortable message. It's somewhere in the vicinity of what I named my book a couple of years ago, The Impossible Conversation. So I see you as being a remarkable voice in the impossible conversation. And what makes you remarkable for me as a reader is the generosity with which you share. So I'm in this conversation a lot. It's basically my entire body of work now, and one thing I've seen is I'm in a lot of circles that range from folks who are at least collapse aware in some way, shape, or form. They're trying to do something to adjust their lives in some small way to be a little bit more prepared. And that ranges all the way to the near-term human extinction crowd, the people that believe that within even my old guy lifetime, we'll see massive die-off of not only millions of species, but ourselves as human beings. Maybe we'll get to this a bit more in depth a little later on in the conversation. But what I'm seeing in the short version of what I'm seeing in those conversations with people who are collapse aware is there's this fixation and a loop that seems like it's the only default level of conversation that we allow ourselves. It is, now that we've landed here, that there are a number of things terribly, terribly wrong. We then go into a loop to just validate that and revalidate that and to hold on firmly, because we need to have something to hold on to. If we can't hold on to the business as usual world, then now we can hold on to that we are so fucked. You know, that we have no direction to go but into extinction and so on. And the entire body of work that I've been putting together is out of my own practices and practices of others that I've seen be quite potent in creating a life in the face of all this. And that doorway into those practices is through the kind of authentic expression that I experience in your writing and now in your speaking. So I appreciate you sitting through all that. I wanted to just give you some context of how that fits, how your work and even your words here speaking so far fits so well into how I'm holding this impossible conversation myself. And I would just like to officially warmly welcome you to the Poetry of Predicament, and it's really good to meet you. And I'm wondering if there's anything that I've mentioned in that sort of recap for myself, if there's anything that it's sparked you to say. And I would just invite you to share at will. And I'm sure I've got questions if you run dry a
well,
bit.
I'll try and sort of keep a storyline going here, but firstly, thank you so much for hosting me on your podcast. And it's incredibly validating to be a voice from the global South and to be heard in the global North. I remember very clearly when the Extinction Rebellion in London first started the quite vocal demonstrations. There was a media backlash from a number of very important broadcasters in London moaning about the inconvenience of a few protesters spray painting walls and sticking themselves to glass. And at the time, I was following this on social media, but at the time I was writing about the cyclone Idai, which had hit the coast of Mozambique, where the city of Beira, 90% of the city was wiped out. And, the British media was talking about the inconvenience of these protests. And I was thinking, you do not have a single idea of what inconvenience means. And, the critics of people who use, the critics of those who use the climate collapse terminology, I am seeing and reporting on collapse right now here in Southern Africa. So, we can grapple about semantics, but if you're a person living in a city where 90% of the infrastructure is wiped out, you are experiencing collapse.
Yes.
You have to try and feed a child when medical services are broken down. There's no food coming into the area. You are literally cut off from any supplies, any roads by the floodwaters. That is collapse. So, I was experiencing this incredible exasperation that started then. There's so much to fill in the meantime. But the exasperation that the global South is maybe not the correct terminology, but developing world countries are experiencing the incredible fallout of climate change already. This isn't something that's going to happen in the future, and to not be heard in the North is exasperating. So that's a little bit of background. But where should we go from here? For your listeners, I want them to sort of understand the context, but let me start at the beginning of the year. At the beginning of the year, I read the most remarkable book. It's a novel by Richard Powers called The Overstory. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. For me, it was one of the most moving books I've read in a decade. And one of the take-home messages, I keep remembering it from, is he talks about how industrial humans have been around for the flicker of nothing in the scale of deep time. And yet in that time, we've turned half the planet into a factory farm for just one species. And taking that sort of bird's eye view of just how much human beings have spread and changed and transformed and destroyed other life forms is just, it was such a poignant message. But at the same time, the story that his novel tracks is the story of people in the States who've been trying to they spend what, 20, 30 years trying to protect these old growth forests. And yet they're fighting against the sort of plunder of these forests by timber merchants and private business. And essentially, in the end, it's almost like they lose the battle, all of these activists, at great personal cost. And the story of those activists is what so many climate activists and scientists are dealing with as well. We can see how broken the system is around us. We know exactly what the fixes are, but the force of the system is so entrenched, it's so deep. You know, how do you even begin to dismantle the system? And that, I think, is where this incredible frustration comes from. But maybe to get back to the mental health fallout, I mean, it's interesting. I've been in therapy for a number of years, and I'm very interested in the internal landscape. Yes. You know, how human beings view themselves as a species, as a collective, but then also this very personal journey of trying to understand oneself as someone who has inherited the human condition. And so I'm very interested in that at a personal level, but it's never come through in my writing. And then this year, I think just because of how severe my emotional response was to the extent of the climate crisis, it started to come through. My original interest was at a purely intellectual level. I was starting to see, because of the way I track the climate science, I started to see more and more people in the health sort of chapter of the climate science community talking about the potential mental health fallout of climate change. Mm-hmm. And by that, they talk about the mental health fallout of an acute stress, so related to an extreme weather event. So if you're a farmer trying to survive a short-term but very severe drought, if your home is burned down because of a wildfire, if your community is dislocated because of a flood, that's an acute episode of stress, which will have all sorts of mental health implications. And then there's the long-term chronic stress of knowing that you're living in a potentially collapsing system. So I was writing about that, and the assumption from this psychology community is that we're going to see a rise of depression, anxiety, potentially, domestic violence, and possibly self-harm and even greater suicidality. So this was a theme that was just running through in the back of my mind for a long time. But then with my own confrontation this year of how severe this climate crisis is, I started to actually see, not just in a head intellectual level, but embodied at an emotional level, what it means to be confronted by this. And maybe I should talk through what happened, which is what I mentioned in the article. It was a night in June this year, and I had just spent the evening sitting on a 3-hour panel discussion trying to convince a group of Cape Townians that the extreme weather events we were seeing around us, that we have for many years all around the world, was an indication of just how unstable our climate has become, so many years ahead of schedule. So we have a small global increase in temperature of only 1 degree relative to pre-industrial times, and yet the impact on our weather systems and our climate is so severe. But I was, throughout the whole 3-hour evening, I was just driving home the message that there's still time to do something. You know, we can drive divestment, we can march on the streets, we can demand that our newspaper editors put the story front and center, etc., etc., etc.
Yes.
And then I came home that night. It was about 10 o'clock at night. It was a balmy winter's night. I was sitting on my front porch in the quiet of the night. The wind was just sort of moving the leaves of the trees a bit. Everything was still. And in that moment, it was literally like a seismic collision. It suddenly hit me that actually it might be too late. You know, we've been seeing reports coming from the Arctic of the extent of Arctic ice and permafrost melting. And this isn't just an extreme weather event. This is an indication that we could be slipping across a dangerous and irreversible tipping point.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, the scientists are telling us that this is happening 70 years ahead of the original modeling. And I sat there. It was the most bizarre thing. I felt this incredible calm come over me. I thought, fuck, this is it. You know, it doesn't matter if it happens in 5 years' time or 10 years' time or 20 years' time, the collapse is coming. And when I spoke with a therapist later, she said that's classic shock symptoms. But I was so, my clarity of thought was so crystal clear in the moment. I put on my walking shoes and I ended up walking through the streets at midnight. Absolute quiet, a little bit of, you know, leaves blowing across the street, just letting all of this sink in. And then I got home and I went to bed, and I got up the next morning and got to my desk as I normally do. And by midday, something quite extraordinary happened. I was on the telephone to a colleague of mine, just talking about a work story. And the next thing, I just melted into these uncontrollable sobs.
Yeah.
And I just said to her, you know, what is the point? You know, we've been working on this field for nearly 20 years. It's hardly shifted anything. And now it's too late. And if I were to die today or in 20 years' time, it's going to make no difference. Mm-hmm. You know, you take a pebble out of the stream and the water fills its space. And in the bigger scheme of things, we're all going to die. Mm-hmm. And she said to me, you know, my friend, you know that this is a very dangerous thought track you're on. And I said, I know, but I don't know what to do about it, you know. And as I said in the article, it was literally like having a brain concussion, that I knew that I needed medical help, but I didn't know how to get it. So I knew my car keys were on the table, but where do I drive? Which emergency room do I go to? What do I tell them when I get there?
Right.
Anyway, fortunately, my colleague and friend got on the phone, and within an hour, she had me sitting on a therapist's couch and talking through it. And I said to this therapist, fortunately, she's someone that I've known for 7-8 years, so we have a good history. I just hadn't seen her for a long time. And my friend made sure that she made an emergency slot for me. But I just said to her, you know, this really does feel like someone who's been given a cancer diagnosis. You know, do I commit to a grueling round of chemotherapy, which is going to be lonely and painful and will extend my life by a bit longer? Or do I just submit to this, allow the cancer to run wild and just get it over with quickly, you know? And I mean, I don't use the cancer metaphor glibly. You know, it's interesting that there have been a lot of people writing in the climate change, climate collapse space, where they use this hospice scenario as a way of helping us understand what we have to cope with. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the good news story out of all of this, it took me many months to recover. I did have to take antidepressants for a while. I'm still taking them. I've been seeing this therapist regularly, working through it. But I think what my story shows is what I'm calling the recovery curve. It starts with denial. So things aren't too bad. We've still got hope. this shattering awakening where you realize things are actually so much worse than we realized.
Yep.
With that comes a physical and emotional collapse. And then slowly out of that, you make sense of this craziness. And then you start to take the approach of someone who realizes they might be living a foreshortened life. And there is so much wisdom from the hospice and palliative care world. How do you, if you know that you only have 5 years left, or 2 years left, or 5 months left, how are you going to live those last days in a way that is most meaningful? And I don't mean a selfish, hedonistic, self-indulgent way. Some may interpret it as that. But how do you make it really meaningful? And for me, the meaningfulness is to keep getting up every day, knowing that the battle may be lost, but still trying, you know. And I don't think it's a naive hopefulness. I think it's a determination that things are going to be hard, and how can we support each other to help alleviate the suffering in that hardship.
Yeah.
You know, part of the collapse was that emotional collapse where I needed medical attention. And then the other collapse was a few months later. I just ended up going to bed for 10 days. I mean, I've hardly taken any sick leave in the 20 years that I've been working. And yet I literally went to bed for 10 days, and I was just so tired. I couldn't concentrate on writing one sentence. I just lay in bed and breathed and slept and breathed and slept. But I have to say that I do feel like I'm on the right side of the recovery curve now, and this work feels more urgent than ever. And I realize that it's not necessarily to change the outcome. It's to make it less painful for other people to survive as this future comes. And, you know, we can quibble about what collapse means and when it's going to come. I don't think the point of that article was about getting into a debate about whether the hopers are right or the doomers are right. It's about realizing that many, many people will go through a very similar potential recovery curve. Many people will feel similar collapse, and there is hope on the other side of that, not to change the outcome, but to find meaning within that.
Yeah, beautifully said. I just find so much to resonate with in your mapping, and I again just so appreciate your willingness to kind of hold our hand and walk that path again as you share it with us, what it's been like. And in my path, my own version of the journey, that curve that you were just talking about, my experience is that there is so much avoidance, active avoidance, first in myself when I look back far enough, and then now in basically the entire culture, global culture. It's so thick, even in the people who, bless their hearts, are activists and out there trying to make a difference. And as you were saying, describing yourself, you know, trying to convince others, it's not too late. We can do this and we can do that. And if we only do this and so on. I sent, while you were speaking, I sent an article over that may be one of the ones that you touched in with in the research you were talking about, when you were trying to get a sense of where is the mental health community with regard to the impacts of these larger scale stressors that we're having. And a woman that I've had on the show a number of times, named Lisa Van Susteren, a psychiatrist here in the States who's an advisor to many different agencies, mental health agencies that address this kind of larger scale epidemiology and so on. She put together a report for I believe it's the National Wildlife Foundation, a number of years back. And the the estimate in their report of how many people would be affected by some sort of chronic or acute symptomology, some sort of symptoms that like what you're describing, just how many people will be affected in some sort of mental health set of symptoms. And it was, what they say there in that report was roughly 200 million. And in the States, I don't know, we're somewhere in the vicinity of 350 million. And what I had subsequently run into with Lisa Van Susteren in those conversations was that they kept finding that they had underestimated. I mean, you and I both know that's almost everybody. And so the scale, it starts to take the breath away.
Yeah. And you know what I think is going to be particularly significant for the US? And I mean, this is my reading of the cultural narrative as an outsider. You know, I think there has been a lot of climate denial in the States for a long time, or the assumption that climate change will hit other countries, it won't hit us because we're wealthy and we can insulate ourselves against these extreme events. And then suddenly you see these incredible hurricanes and tornadoes and these dreadful wildfires, you know, the California wildfires. And then suddenly you realize that actually even these wealthy communities are not insulated.
Right.
And I think the wake-up call for many Americans and the stress and terror associated with that is going to be significant. You know, I mean, it's interesting. I think the mental health community is starting to wake up to the fact that those skills now need to be applied to more than just, you know, people who come in with traditional sort of causes for mental health challenges. You know, how do we scale this up? How do we make these kinds of support services available more widely? And I think an important point you raised earlier, you hinted at your own practice, you know, what your sort of daily practice is. I talk about it as a metaphor for mental health is like good oral hygiene. You need to do certain little things every day to keep yourself on the straight and narrow, like brush your teeth every day, floss. Every now and then you need to go to the dentist. And then sometimes you need a root canal. And mental health treatment is very similar. So, you know, I think there are so many people out there who are skilled in those daily practices, whether it's running or dancing or yoga or sitting meditation, some kind of contemplative practice, connecting with friends, you know, all these little things. And then occasionally you need to see a therapist. The root canal analogy takes me into a completely different area, which doesn't come through in my story, and I'm not sure if it's appropriate to bring it into this podcast. But I'm also very interested in the medical advances around the therapeutic use of psychedelics as a way of treating mental health. And I'm writing a book on that at the moment, actually. But interestingly enough, I kind of see the root canal metaphor as what these psychedelic sessions are often like. They're almost like a short, sharp surgical intervention to lance a boil that is causing mental turmoil. Yeah. So, you know, I think when people like you are telling these stories and doing this work, part of the potency of it is sharing with others what practices work for you that allow you to just keep your feet on the ground on a daily way. And that allows you to be more resilient as you get buffered by this extreme stuff coming in, the news, etc.
Yeah. Leonie, boy, have we got about 6 hours that we can continue this particular episode? Yeah. So it's totally appropriate, by the way. So please don't hedge at all. I don't hear you doing that, but don't worry at all about going beyond some level of acceptable conversation or something. I would just like to kind of weave in a couple of pieces because I am in total agreement with what you just laid out. I love the simple oral hygiene analogy. In my work and in my own practices, really for my lifetime, little did I know that that practices that I started in my early teens and continued through my life would be so important now. And more formal corporate training or personal development training that I may have done for most of my career would have less and less, real function, real importance in this chapter of life. The interventions that you're talking about, I have a substantial amount of experience with plant medicine and with psychedelics, and could agree with you. One thing I find in my own experience of having done many journeys and guided many journeys is that a remarkable number of people really don't have a baseline in their experience to be able to have somewhere to land back into. That doesn't mean that nobody should do it, but I just am noticing that over time I've run into so many folks who are hungry for the breakthrough that's implied by what you're talking about. And I again agree completely. It is available, but it is not guaranteed. The path is not the same for everyone. And so a big part of my work is to offer people practices to reconnect. When I started researching my book, I kept asking the simplest question I could: what got us into this predicament? Because how I couch it is, we're in a predicament. We're long past the solutions phase. Although, and please don't hear, I want us to be working on solutions hard, but that in the disconnection from the primary sources of meaning in a human life, from deeper self, from each other, from earth, and from soul, and without taking on practices to do reconnection, there's virtually no action, no activity that will be grounded, that will be action that will move us forward in some good way.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I think I was having a fascinating conversation with a therapist friend of mine who works with trauma.
Yeah.
And she was saying, for some people, they are just unable to unlock the grip of the depression, etc. Because in some cases, people are just not willing to go there. So whether it's through therapy, through sitting with the pain and meditation, a contemplative practice of any sort, they just will not go there. And that results in people getting stuck. And you can throw plant medicines in that, it's also not going to help, because plant medicine is very much just like committing to ordinary talk therapy, just supercharged. So if you're not really willing to face the darkness, dare I say, to confront what is uncomfortable inside you, that's the one point. And the second point, which you just triggered a thought in my mind, is absolutely this thing about connection. The Western sort of worldview and Western conditioning has just, it's just conditioned us to be separate from nature, to see ourselves as overlords of nature, and to be separate from one another. And I think that brings a profound spiritual paucity in ourselves. And I use the word spiritual because I don't know what other word is appropriate. Right. I don't believe in a God. I'm an atheist, but I do believe that human beings are evolved to feel connection in whatever way, whether it's with a higher being, whether it's with each other, whether it's with nature. Yeah. If you consider that, for the almost 200,000 years that modern humans have been around, for the vast majority of that time, we were hunter-gatherers. We were living this sort of animist life where we believed that trees and rocks and rivers and every species had a spirit, and we were all connected to that greater community. And then, we've only been industrial humans for 300 years. And then we've been caught up in this sort of capitalist machine the neoliberal capitalist machine for the last 50 years. and that has conditioned us to be separate. So I think we have the ancient echoes of that connection inherent in our being, and these practices are a way of reawakening that. But it does require discipline. It does require knowledge. And I mean, I think for me, one of the most profound forms of connection is just being out on the mountain. You know, I live very close to Table Mountain. I am a very privileged middle-class South African, so I have access to a space that many other South Africans don't. But I know that in those hours of just crunching over the trail, often in solitude, just listening to the birds and looking at these tiny, beautiful little fynbos flowers that are endemic to the area, don't occur anywhere else on the planet. I find this incredible calm. My ruminating thoughts discharge all of the tension that's been building up in my body through the day, sitting at my desk, and quietness settles. I find it very hard to do sitting practice because I'm very fidgety, and I have to sit at my desk so much. But that quiet ambulation with the crunch, crunch, breathe, breathe of my feet on the gravel and my lungs working is incredibly grounding and connecting. And I think, I mean, many people have different ways of doing that. Some people love to just dance. Other people like yoga. Some people like surfing or rock climbing, but there's something about stepping out of our cognitive kind of churning and allowing that flow state settling to happen.
Yeah. You know, I feel blessed that I get to have this kind of conversation with a lot of different kinds of people who are good at different things. And there's one guy that I talk to from time to time. He's a designer of regenerative systems for human beings to possibly integrate into their communities at some local scale, anywhere in the world. His name is Joe Brewer.
Oh, yes, I follow him on Facebook.
All right.
Yeah.
And you know what I appreciate about him is he's such a polymath. He's just got such a broad range in what he puts together to synthesize into his brand of this work. And I remember asking him in an interview, Joe, so if a person was wanting to shift from being in, you know, neck deep in this culture as we all are, and we want to step somehow closer to this regenerative system that you're suggesting, how do we prepare ourselves? What's the inner preparation that a sincere practitioner would want to do walking toward what you're creating? And he was quick to say, kind of the short version of his answer was, they want to have advanced self-regulation skills, and I'll say more about that in a minute, and a psychological flexibility. That was his short answer. And of course, we talked about it more, and there, I touch on it quite often in other podcasts. But I'm curious, you know, you seem to be talking about those two things in your own language quite a bit. And again, I couldn't agree more with you and with Joe that there is an obvious membrane of resistance that we have culturally. Here we are, just maybe 100 years into our full involvement with fossil fuels, and I think more accurately, it's probably more like 75, where it's really, you know, pumped into our veins. And it is a drug. It is the most addictive experience humanity's ever had to grapple with. And now we're supposed to kick it cold turkey. You know, we're supposed to use 50% of it, less of it within 10 years, and then kick it completely by 2050. Yeah. So that seems to fit really well with that challenge, and what we might have to do about it seems to fit really well with those two pieces: self-regulation and a psychological flexibility. And while I could say more, I'm really curious if that sparks you to say anything.
It does. I think so much of so what is self-regulation? It's I'm not a psychologist,
I'm
but
happy to give you my version if it's helpful.
yes, go for it.
Okay. So in my experience of self-regulation is if there's a state that I call normal or home or comfortable in my experience, I have my wits about me. I might even have a little bit of a sense of humor. I have some room for a surprise to come my way, positive or negative. I got a little space for it. It's kind of annoying, but I can do it. As I am more and more dysregulated, or I'm somehow compressed in my capacity to hold more and more, as every day wants to be bringing me more and more, then that dysregulated state becomes more and more normalized. And that dysregulated state for most of us is so much of what we see on a larger scale. We're tending to polarize and project with other people. We don't have a sense of connection with them. We tend to polarize, and fear is often involved in that separation. And the self-regulation part would be, how do I return myself volitionally, consciously to that optimal state? Whether that's through the most basic, these are just, so much of this is so basic. It's remarkable. I'm doing a couple of them right now. I'm noticing my feet on the floor, and I'm noticing my hands pressing the pressure of my skin against the desk. I'm noticing the coolness on my skin. I'm noticing that I have a green screen in this room, and I'm noticing a green tint on the wall to my right, and on it goes.
Yeah. So I love the way you frame that. Sorry, I'm interrupting you, Dean.
No, please. I'm just done. I'm good.
I love the way you frame that, because what I wanted to say around your reflection on us being addicted to fossil fuels is that so much of our behavior, and I'm speaking now as relatively well-resourced middle-class people, so much of our behavior is finding unhealthy ways to avoid the discomfort of being human. So all of those, you were saying things come at you every day. Some of them are what we would label as pleasant, some not pleasant. Some push us into a state of discomfort, whether it's anxiety or whatever it is. But if we are brain trained and exercised in self-regulation, we can find ways to sit comfortably through the discomfort and not run off to distraction. And distraction often involves television, social media, shopping, food, alcohol, cigarettes, all of these things which allow us to self-medicate against that discomfort. And what you're talking about, or what I think people fear around a changing system where we don't have cheap fossil fuel energy anymore, is the loss of those things that allow us to self-medicate against the pain of being human.
Yeah.
There are very old-fashioned, dare I say, old-fashioned practices, which we've talked about, which people have been practicing for thousands of years to find ways to deal with the discomfort of being human. And fortunately, we have this in our sort of collective resource bank. We can go to Buddhist practice, all sorts of different prayer practices from different cultures, exercise practices, whatever. They're all out there. We can just draw on them. The change doesn't have to be as frightening. And the other thing, just to return to this concept of death and dying, which is what really brought us into this conversation, is I think Westerners are conditioned also to not think about death too much. The other cultures where it's just completely part of the cycle of life and it's not frightening. But many Westerners don't think about it. And it's only when you are, for instance, confronted with the news that you may have a terminal illness, what they call it the existential slap, when you're suddenly forced to realize that your time on this planet is limited. And that can be deeply troubling for people who don't confront that reality often, or where it's just not integral to their culture to accept life as just another breath in our journey through the cosmos.
I'm I'm wondering if we could loop back for just a few moments to it seemed like you were pointing to a deeper self-intervention or self-growth intent.
Mm.
If one is on a path to hopefully greater capacity to be present. And now in this most recent few sentences, you've been talking about the, I'm sorry, gosh, how did you just say it? To become more comfortable in the face of the inherent discomfort of the human condition.
Mhm.
And the one example that you used and talked that you were you're writing a book about it is the use of psychedelics as one of those tools or facilitators to expand our capacity in a very particular way, almost like a specialized workout that
Mm.
one can do to expand a certain part of our consciousness, a certain area of our experience and intent. And I wanted to mention an alternative that I tend to suggest to people because I found for myself, I needed to eventually be able to do these things without the psychedelics because they're pretty intense on the system. And so there are certain transformation-based practices kind of based in some way on some of the wisdom traditions that I think you were just pointing at. And they're very, very active. You know, they start where really intensive therapy ends. You know, they're really like going for it. you have to have really worked out and really be in practice, you know, like the running a marathon kind of a analogy. I'm wondering if there are any of those more advanced practices or advanced kind of inner preparation or inner expansion of capacity notions that or practices that you're aware of, that you do, that you are headed toward. Does this spark you to share anything?
Um, so I did find it interesting when I first started looking into psychedelics as a medicine, but also as a form of your self-actualization process, etc. I was, because this whole area was very new to me up until a few years ago. I was intrigued when I discovered that in the 1960s, when we first started to see sort of Western philosophers drawing on Eastern philosophy, but at the same time beginning to get exposed to psychedelics. This was the first time you were seeing these two different traditions coming together. And a lot of these people, I think we're talking about Alan Watts here and a number of others, you know, they explained how a few, using psychedelics was a great entry point, but actually that they could achieve the same state, whether it's altered consciousness or ego dissolution, from just everyday sitting practice, which the Buddhist tradition has been using for a very long time. So often psychedelics were a key to open a door, but once the door was open, they just needed to sit every day and they could almost achieve the same state. And so they abandoned the psychedelics. I found that absolutely fascinating. I have to say, and this is a confession and an area of my own lack of self-growth that I'm most frustrated with, is that I'm not disciplined with sitting practice. And I realized that daily short sitting practice would do me the world of good. And yet I just can't seem to get to it. So it's an area that I need to put a lot of work into.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been involved one way or another with various practices, contemplative practices in particular. And I'm also just terrible at the sitting idea, just the flat out sitting, no stimulus, just, oh my God. At least when I was given a mantra, that took care of a little bit of my brain just going nuts. And aware now of enough kind of middle ground alternatives that I think have a better chance of being effective for people like you and me than the small handful of people who already were spiritual practitioners at an extraordinary level. For them to be able to say, yeah, I sat for 30 years and then I did some psychedelics either before or after that. And, what I found was they're very, very similar. 25 years of sitting and doing some LSD, hey, same thing. So take your pick.
Yeah.
Which for me
I
would
must be
like,
honest, I quite like the opportunity of being jet propelled into that space. But there's a very important message that comes through. Who's the guy who wrote Stealing Fire? Is it Jamie Wheel?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
So Stealing Fire is around altered states of consciousness and how different groups are using them to perform better, whatever. But one of the things that he mentions in a follow-up book that he's worked on, and I forget the name, he talks about, and I think this is really important for where we're at right now on this planet, he talks about the urgent need to take this personal self-growth, self-actualization, outside of our own sort of self-indulgent enjoyment of it. And we have to now make it about more than ourselves. So for people like you and me and anyone else working in this space, all of the years of contemplative practice, sitting for 30 years, or taking psychedelics to jet propel yourself into a state of enlightenment, we have to move beyond just using that as something that makes our own lives easier. We need to take that transcendence outside of ourselves. And how do we do that? And for every person it can happen in a different way, but for me, I mean, what I found interesting about my own, I've seen a distinct change in my voice in the last 2 years. I don't know, I was always quite timid in how I articulated things. I didn't like being in the public eye, but in the past 2 years I've become a lot louder, a lot less edited. I'm 47. I don't know if at this stage you have no more fucks left to give, or if you suddenly realize, that time is short and we have urgent work to do. But I suddenly find myself speaking much more boldly, losing my patience with the same old business as usual narratives, demanding accountability from other journalists who are, in my opinion, in dereliction of duty. The media is a load-bearing wall in the fourth estate, or in a healthy democracy. This idea of the fourth estate. I mean, this is how you keep a healthy, functioning society, is you have a loud, transparent press that tells it like it is. And for our media to not be telling the climate story as it should be means they are failing the citizens. And I get very angry. So interestingly enough, I'm much less timid, and it could be a little bit to do with psychedelics. It could be a little bit to do with getting older, and it could be to do with finally just losing my patience with people who dial down the message on this, as you said earlier, the most urgent story of our times.
Yeah. Would you say again the name, excuse me, the name of the book you just mentioned?
Yes, it's Stealing Fire by Jamie Wheel.
Stealing
Fire.
Okay.
Let me just double check. Sorry, I've got so many names in my head.
Great.
Jamie Wheel and Stephen Coulter. I mean, I'm a little bit critical of that specific way of thinking, because it's often looking at how people use these altered states just so that they can become better performing machines within a capitalist system.
Right.
And that is not what awakening and consciousness shifting is supposed to be about. But that's a story for another day. But interestingly enough, I just a week ago I was given the TED platform, the speaking format, we have a couple of TEDx functions in Cape Town every year. And a week ago was given an opportunity to speak on that platform. It should be live in the next week or so, but really looking at the climate crisis, the extent of how particularly the last 50 years of this predatory capitalism has brought us to this planetary emergency, and then the opportunity to draw on indigenous knowledge systems, which then put us back in symbiosis with nature. And then, of course, a chapter of that is many indigenous communities around the world have been using psychedelics for thousands of years.
Yep.
And the psychedelics use produces a nature awakening and a heightened sense of empathy. And I mean, even the studies from Imperial College London, where they're using psilocybin from psilocybin mushrooms to treat depression, they've produced a number of studies where they document the nature awakening that people experience during a psilocybin dosing session. And of course, they're now, publishing all of these academic studies to show this, but really they're just confirming what psychedelics users in the underground community have been reporting for decades, and what indigenous communities, the entire cosmology has been shaped by psychedelics use, which again allows for this awe of nature and this realization that we are nature, we're part of nature, we're not the overlords of nature. So I think that's an interesting, thing that we can think about. If the culturally appropriate and responsible use of these plant medicines, as they're called, even though psilocybin isn't a plant, but how it could possibly bring about social healing and the political disruption we need in the face of this planetary emergency. And that is another one of the interesting side effects of psychedelics use, is a tendency towards anti-establishment thinking. Did the anti-war movement of the 1960s find psychedelics because they were already a bit counterculture? Or did, psychedelics use fire up in them this civil disobedience and an urgency to take on the establishment? And you probably picked up one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion in the UK. She went public a few months ago about how her own use of ayahuasca, the psychedelic that is used extensively in the Amazon, how that had shifted her own consciousness and drove her to found this global mass movement.
Yeah, I'm with you.
But yes, I think the nub of the original point was that these daily practices are really important so that we can be healthy and wholesome.
Yeah.
And then we take the work outside of ourselves and fight, to, we may not be able to take down the system, but we can maybe help alleviate other suffering in the system.
Yeah. It seems like you've drawn a circle for us to return to, instead of the content or the prompts that might take us to the state, you've gotten us back to toward the state itself, the state of being, that I think we're both pointing at in our different ways and through our different stories and so on. I'm curious, I'd like to just take us even one step further back to the very beginning of the conversation, sort of the aha or the woke moment when you realized maybe it is too late. Maybe it is too late. And I'm curious if you could just say a little bit about how that has matured or ripened as a realization, as an actual experience for you. When you say collapse or you say it's too late, what are you seeing? How do you imagine it showing up in your community, in South Africa, in the world? What's your view? And if you have a timeline on any element of it that you just sort of work with, I know we're all just making shit up. And I'm just wondering where you've landed with what's coming and when.
Okay, so that's a very good question. South Africa or Southern Africa is experiencing what is the worst drought in over a century of record keeping. And that obviously expresses itself in different places in different ways. And Many in the farming community, which would be, 1,000 kilometers from me, so it doesn't touch me immediately. You're seeing farmers committing suicide out of despair. In my immediate community, Cape Town, which is where I'm at, I should have said that at the beginning of the interview, Cape Town experienced the same drought, and as a result, in January last year, 2018, which is our summer, we very nearly ran out of water. The city nearly ran out of water. They came literally within 3 months of emergency rationing measures where they were going to shut down all water to homes and businesses outside of the core city center. They were going to distribute water through 200 distribution points. So, ordinary middle-class people who are used to turning the tap would have to go and queue for hours with buckets to go and get 25 liters of water a day.
Yeah.
I mean, that's nothing, So businesses would have been disrupted, schools would have been shut down. The impact on the economy would have been absolutely staggering. And for the first time, this issue that I've been writing about is a distant thing that will happen to other people. I suddenly thought, shit, it could happen to me. Mm-hmm. Everything that I own and my entire sort of retirement plan is invested in the small flat a little apartment that I own in the suburbs of Cape Town. If the property price collapses and the grid collapses, let's say we suddenly no longer have running water, what do you do with your daily bowel movement when you live in a block of flats? What do you do when a city of 4 million people where the sewage system shuts down? So you started to see people in Cape Town panicking a little bit, but also trying to problem solve. But in the midst of that, I suddenly started to think, well, how do I plan for my retirement if everything I own is invested in this flat and the property market collapses? So that started me thinking. And then I started to realize just how vulnerable this city is right here on the southern tip of Africa. What happens if food systems start collapsing? A third of the African continent is now being pummeled by this terrible drought. And it's having massive food production implications. It's going to ripple through eventually. So I don't have a timeline, but I know that collapse, it will take different shapes in different places. And in Cape Town, it could be the collapsing water system. The municipal grid might fail. It could be the collapse of food across the region, which will push prices sky high. Given the property that I live in, it's very difficult for me to go off grid. So I can't, harvest rainwater. It's difficult to go off the electricity grid, and I certainly can't grow my own food except in a few little planters. So I suddenly started to think, well, what do I do? So I'm now trying to sell my flat. This is my climate resilience strategy.
Yes.
Is to sell my flat and then to take what little I have and invest it in a way that is more resilient in a situation where the markets might collapse. And how do we do that? I remember listening to an Australian scientist talking about how her climate resilience strategy was, you need to have multiple languages, multiple passports, and transferable skills. And I would add to that mobile assets. But again, I don't want to run from the problem. I would like to be able to stay and work through it because communities are going to need support. I just don't have the practical skills. Some people are engineers, plumbers, nurses. Some people know how to grow food. I don't have any of those skills. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how useful I would be come the collapse. But I think your point about timelines is there is no timeline. There is just uncertainty. I don't know how to plan for the kind of old age that my parents planned for. My parents are now in their late 70s, but my dad is about to turn 80. And, they provided for themselves, so they're fine. But the world that you and I are going to retire into is going to look very different. And the uncertainty that comes with that, we have no blueprint. We've got no roadmap to tell us how to do it. Mm-hmm. And that uncertainty in itself is very destabilizing. And then, and I think the emotional consequences of that uncertainty can be quite hard. And I mean, I was having a conversation with a young woman recently who is 30, and she is in end-stage cancer. And the conversation bizarrely just went into the strange space that I'm in, where I don't know what to plan for anymore. And the only next step is to sell this apartment and then see what happens. And she said, well, that's exactly it. All you can do is plan for the next step. And I mean, this is a young woman who understands that she only has probably not even a year left. You know, it's such wisdom from this young woman.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mortality tends to bring out wisdom from many of us anyway. It's not a guarantor, but it's but it's possible. Yeah.
The other thing that I'm really struggling with at the moment is, following these wildfires in Australia. I mean, just the most dreadful stories of the animal suffering, you know, these koalas and the flying foxes and etc. that are getting killed in these fires. They just can't escape. And, you know, when you allow yourself, you can't look away because, you know, one doesn't want to shame others by saying we're all part of this. We created this, but we did. And to be sitting here in the comfort of my home, knowing that there could be a koala bear at the top of a eucalyptus tree in Australia that can't escape and is being burned to death. I know that's very raw for listeners, but this is the kind of horror also that it makes me feel physically sick.
Yeah.
And the thought that there is that much suffering out there and it's probably going to get worse. It will get worse. Coping with that is, sometimes you need headache tablets on standby. And that's just a metaphor for those other practices, you know, about how to just alleviate that pain when it gets too much.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is a good time for me to share my way of describing that state, that regulated state that I've somehow cobbled together for myself in this lifetime and that I bring to this work. And I would love to hear whatever you might want to share about yours. I also am not a religious person. If anything, I've been very antagonistic to what I know of the history of religion. But ironically, I've had many, many impossible conversations like this one with many different kinds of people, including fundamentalist Christians, who are some of the most difficult, oftentimes the most difficult for me to have just small talk with, much less a meaningful conversation. But there have been so many of these in-depth conversations that I've had with them where I wasn't at all trying to convince them of the rightness of my timeline or my projected collapse events that are coming and so on. But I would share with them this state that I have had the privilege of being immersed in a number of times in my life. And some of those times were months on end, which I know now is an extraordinarily rare occurrence. You know, for a person to have this once in their life could be considered something like Satori or Nirvana or this extraordinarily the direct experience of interbeing and so on. And what I've learned is to just call it grace. That seems to be a common enough word in enough traditions that has enough similarity or overlap for people who can be quite different in other ways might be able to share this particular understanding or framing of this experience of state of being. And so I'm clear that I would not be alive now if it weren't for my ability to access this state of grace at will. What you've just been describing, my version, I absolutely hear and feel and appreciate you sharing about the animals and their suffering recently in Australia. Just one of countless examples of suffering at some level or another in this global experience. Mine is the ocean. I
Mm.
uh, I have always found great solace in being next to the ocean, and I know that the ocean's dying.
Mm.
I know that there's more plastic than biomass
Mm.
in the ocean. I know that the acidification is doing extraordinary damage. There are dead zones beyond count at this point.
Mm.
I know that both the coral reefs and the fisheries of the world are projected to be both completely collapsed before 2050.
Mm.
And so I'm saying this not to just pummel us all with more facts and figures, but I'm mentioning it that I'm holding these things, and this is among they are all in the vicinity of the thing that I most anchored to in terms of what I love, what matters most to me in this world,
Mm.
and the core of that is through the ocean.
Mm.
And so it has a lot to do with my ability to access this state of grace that allows me to hold that level of deep grief. I don't know that the word grief, as we usually use it, is big enough. I
Mm.
don't know what's beyond that, but that's what I'm
Mm.
talking about.
Yeah.
And I believe that you're pointing in a similar direction to your version of that. It
Mm.
seems like we're both talking about how on earth can we hold our mortality, our day-to-day living, the things we call normal,
Mm.
watching TV and enjoying some popcorn, all the stuff of life, and the reality of the depth of the suffering
Mm.
you were pointing to, the things that I was just mentioning.
Mm.
We are truly immense beings. The possibility of us holding a huge amount, it is there. That possibility is there. I think
Yeah.
Joanna Macy says it really beautifully, that the heart that's broken open can hold the entire universe.
Lovely. I want to give you a little story quickly to reflect back
Yeah.
um, the process of finding grace, and I think it's still one that I'm trying to figure out. But I had an interesting experience recently. I went to a workshop, and you'll recognize the story from the Daily Maverick piece. I went to a workshop which was supposedly a group of people who are completely awake to the climate crisis. And at the end of it, I was quite frustrated because people were still staying with the little superficial changes like convince your neighbor to recycle. And I was getting frustrated saying, no, we need so much more. We need, radical activism, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of it, I just said, what if we are baked into a 3-degree trajectory? What if it is too late? And in the midst of that, I just started sobbing. And I mean, it was a group of about 20 people, and there was such a backlash from the room. No, it's not nearly that bad. It's not that bad. I don't believe the science, blah, blah, blah. And I just sat there covered with shame and feeling alienated, and I just cried. And at the end of it, most of the group disappeared awkwardly. And a couple of women came and sat down next to me, and one of them introduced herself as Christine. And she said that she has been working as a palliative counselor, working with people in end-of-life illnesses for 10 years. She said she'd been sitting in that workshop for 2 days thinking, why am I here? And she said, when I saw what happened in the room when you started crying, I understood why I was here. And she explained it to me like this. She said, when someone typically realizes that the cancer is very severe, they go home and they say to their family, I'm dying. And the family and they say, I've decided I don't want any more chemo. I'm done. I just want to live out my last days, weeks, months with grace. And invariably, this woman said, invariably what happens is the family pushes back and says, no, you can't give up. You have to keep fighting. It's not over. Just try harder to get yourself healthy. Try this diet, try that operation, blah, blah, blah. um, it happens again and again and again with people who tell their family that they're dying. And she said all that, even though it's well-meaning, that feedback from the family is well-meaning, and designed to give the person hope and keep them fighting, actually it just leaves the person feeling more alienated and alone. And she said what you really have to do with someone when they've been given a terminal diagnosis is just sit with them and allow them to completely sink into that pain. And it's uncomfortable, it's hard to do, but that's what you need to do. And she said, this is what we need to do with people when they fully experience the kind of pain and grief that you're talking about. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, it makes people feel out of control. But how can we graciously sit with people and allow them safely to fully dissolve into that pain? And I think that's a skill that we're going to have to learn. And it's one that's available to us. You know, there are many people who've worked with those in sort of end of life states, that can allow, you know, for the messiness of that pain to express itself. It's not something that I have much experience with, but I think on the other side of that is tremendous grace.
Yeah, I agree completely. And that is indeed the nature of the work that I'm involved with. So, Leonie, it's deep pleasure. It just feels like there's a kinship, really since beginning to read your article, but now far more so after hearing your words and feeling your presence. I so thank you for your generous sharing of what's there for you in this, the most difficult time in human history. And I wish you well in selling your flat.
Thank you. And you know, I mean, Dean, I don't know how old you are. I'm 47. If I'm lucky, I get to live another 40 years in this body.
Yeah.
Maybe only 10, maybe 5. Maybe I get an illness tomorrow. But this whole experience has reminded me that every single day is precious, and every single day, you know, a moment of enjoying the presence of a flower or a bee or my cat meowing at me is a precious one. And it's shifted my way of relating to the world. But also I just want to thank you for recognizing the work and the voice, and for connecting. I think I'm looking forward to dipping into your other podcasts and just benefiting from the wisdom I think that's going to come through in many of those stories.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really hope against hope that there are many more opportunities for you and me to get together and have this kind of conversation. One that comes to mind is I heard through a fellow South African, Elzan Roos. I imagine you may have spoken with her. Oh, my goodness. Well, you should. I think you two would just get along famously. And we're all one way or another connected with something called the Deep Adaptation Forum, or perhaps a positive deep adaptation Facebook group, if that's what people do. And I'm wondering if perhaps you might consider some point early in this coming year coming on to the Deep Adaptation Forum in the group that I'm a volunteer moderator with this group. And we've been doing a series of Q&A sessions with people who have something to say about how shall we comport ourselves in the face of the collapse of Earth and human systems. And I believe that you have, and I experience that you have so very much to say.
Well, I would love to be part of the wider conversation. And, you know, I'm so grateful that modern internet communication has allowed this incredible network to grow internationally. It's incredible. So I would love to remain within the conversation. And thank you for the opportunity to do that.
Great. I will, of course, be putting the links to your article and anything else you'd like to include. Send me an email with any other link to a way to be hold of you that you'd like to invite people from the public to reach out to you if that's appropriate. And I will, of course, extend my invitations a number of times before the end of the year, and see if we can't come up with a date to be able to do that. Leonie, thank you so much again. It's just been a remarkable conversation and walk with you along this path.
Thank you, Dean. It was lovely to meet you.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.